I remember the first time I ever stood in front of the crowd at City Hall. My hands were shaking so badly I thought they'd betray me, that everyone would see my fear. But I held my chin high. I had to. There was too much at stake for me to falter. The room smelled of polished wood, old books, and tension. Flags hung behind the podium, proud symbols of the city's ideals, ideals I had spent years feeling excluded from. I, a black woman from the South Side, was here to speak truth, and yet somehow I felt painfully small. He walked in then, white, towering, confident. Councilman Theodore Hargrove, a politician whose career was built on charm, influence, and a carefully maintained image of civility. But when he saw me, his smile turned sharp, predatory. "Ms. Daniels," he said loudly, with mock patience, "I don't think this is the place for your theatrics. Maybe another time when you're better prepared." Every eye turned to me. Officials froze mid-note taking. Cameras blinked, capturing my humiliation in real time. My stomach sank, but I forced my hands to stay on the podium. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to belittle me. The world had been teaching me lessons like this my whole life, lessons about who I was allowed to be, what I was allowed to say, and how I was expected to bend my spirit just to survive. But I wasn't here to survive. Not today. I cleared my throat. My voice trembled, but I started speaking. Words I had rehearsed for weeks now poured out, steadying themselves on their own. "I'm not here to entertain your doubts, sir. I'm here to demand accountability for decisions that affect our community, the people you claim to serve." The room held its breath. Even the council members who usually nodded along politely seemed caught off guard. Theodore's jaw tightened. "Bold words," he said, leaning toward the podium. "Bold but naive. You know nothing of what goes into these decisions." I looked him straight in the eye. "I know enough to see when promises are broken, when people are silenced, and when courage is mocked because of the color of their skin. I know enough to stand here and speak for those who cannot." Whispers began to ripple through the chamber. Some supportive, some skeptical, some shocked that anyone had the audacity to defy a man of his stature. Then he did it. The move I had feared since the moment I stepped into the building. "You think your voice matters here," he shouted. "Do you understand the power you're trying to wield, Ms. Daniels? You are nothing but a distraction, a spectacle for attention-seeking and applause." A few officials laughed politely, the kind of laugh that cuts the soul, like knives disguised as civility. My heart hammered, my hands shook harder, but I forced myself to take a slow breath. "I am not a distraction," I said softly but firmly. "And I am not here for applause, I am here for truth." And then it happened, the first crack in the armor of the powerful. A few members of the audience began to murmur support. One or two stood quietly, almost imperceptibly, nodding in agreement. The tension in the room shifted ever so slightly. But Theodore Hargrove didn't see it coming. He thought the humiliation would finish me. He didn't understand that humiliation can sometimes sharpen your resolve instead of breaking it. As I continued, my words grew stronger. I recounted stories of neglect, injustice, and the silent suffering that the city ignored. I told the truth about people who were forgotten by policies, erased by bureaucracy, and laughed at by those who held the power to make change. By the time I finished, my voice was steady. The room was silent, but this silence was different now. It was no longer one of judgment. It was one of awareness, of recognition, and the whispers of support began to grow. I could feel the eyes of ordinary citizens in the room, those who had been silenced for too long, shifting their gaze toward me with hope, curiosity, and finally, respect. The councilman's face had turned red with fury. He opened his mouth, likely to fire another insult, to strike me down publicly again, but something had changed. The energy had shifted. The audience was no longer on his side. And in that moment, I realized something vital. The humiliation meant nothing if I could channel it into courage. My fear had become my armor. My pain had become my voice. The room, once a chamber of judgment, had begun to transform into a space where truth could no longer be ignored. That was the moment I knew. The story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every person who had ever been mocked, silenced, or dismissed because of who they were. And the real story, the shocking reversal, had not yet even begun. I stood at the podium, my hands still trembling, my chest tight, but something had shifted. The air no longer weighed on me like a physical force. The laughter that had sliced at my dignity was fading. I could feel it, the quiet stir of awareness among the crowd. At first, it was subtle. A slight nod from one council member, a cough from someone in the audience who clearly disagreed with the man at the podium. Then, a murmur, a ripple. A few whispered words of encouragement that spread like a quiet wave. And that's when I realized the most dangerous thing for Theodore Hargrove wasn't my words. It wasn't even my courage. It was the people watching. The room was full of spectators, ordinary citizens and city employees, some with cameras in hand, all recording. Their faces reflected everything he could not control: disbelief, curiosity, even admiration. And slowly, the whispers became louder. Some audibly whispered, "She's right." The councilman's face hardened, his jaw clenched. He leaned toward the microphone and tried to dominate again. "Enough of this theater, Ms. Daniels," he barked. "Your grievances are based on emotion, not fact. Do you think you can sway this chamber with your words alone?" I inhaled slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. The kind of silence that happens when an audience is no longer complicit in cruelty. "I do not seek to sway anyone with emotion, councilman," I said, voice rising steadily. "I seek to reveal the facts you hope to hide. I seek to speak for the people who are ignored, dismissed, and disrespected every day. I speak for those who cannot stand at this podium without fear of being mocked or silenced." A woman in the front row stood up quietly. A man followed. Soon, more began rising, one by one, as if they had been waiting for permission to act. Their eyes were fixed on Theodore Hargrove. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. "Sit down," he snapped, his tone sharp but shaky. "You have no authority here. No one here cares about your feelings." The murmurs grew into audible protests. "She's telling the truth," someone called. "This is our city, too." My pulse quickened, but I stayed grounded. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless in a place that demanded silence. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. A city council member, usually silent and deferential to Theodore, stood. "I support Ms. Daniels," he said firmly. "Her concerns are valid. This chamber should listen." Heads turned, cameras shifted. Even the journalists who had been scribbling notes paused, captivated. Theodore's face turned red, his hands gripping the podium tightly, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. You dare?" he began, but his words fell flat. The crowd had already decided. Their eyes were no longer on him, they were on me. A floodgate had opened. More voices rose in support. Murmurs became calls. Calls became shouts. People were standing in unison now, their backs straight, their faces proud. I felt a thrill I had never experienced before, power without entitlement, strength without malice, justice without weapons. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Humiliation could only hurt as long as you believed you deserved it. But courage, true courage, ignites hope. And hope cannot be silenced. Councilman Hargrove backed toward the dais, flustered, powerless. His carefully constructed mask of control had cracked. He sputtered, trying to regain authority, but no one listened. The chamber had turned. The crowd had chosen truth. I looked down at my hands, still trembling, and realized they were steady now. The fear was still there, yes, but beneath it, something stronger: resolve. The kind of resolve that grows when injustice is confronted, when humiliation is deflected into action. The murmurs turned into chants. Small at first, then louder, bolder. "Truth, truth, truth." The sound reverberated off the marble walls, shaking the chamber in a way no amount of political power could suppress. And that's when I saw it, one of the politicians closest to Hargrove, usually his ally, now watching him with thinly veiled disgust. I saw others whispering urgently, sharing the fact that the man they had revered for years was faltering. The empire of arrogance he had built was crumbling in real time, and the people were its earthquake. I gripped the podium, took a breath, and let my voice carry to every corner of the room. I am not afraid. I will not be silenced. And the truth will be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it makes those in power. A single gasp echoed through the chamber, followed by applause, then another, and another. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, a wave of affirmation that swept through me like fire. Councilman Hargrove's face had lost its color. His carefully rehearsed insults, his cruel laughter, his smirks, they were all gone. Power, I realized, is fleeting. Authority can be challenged. And the courage of one voice can turn a room. But I knew this was only the beginning. The councilman would not accept this defeat quietly. There would be reprisals. There would be attempts to undermine me, to erase what had just happened. And yet, for the first time, I felt invincible, not because I was stronger than him, but because I was no longer alone. The crowd had turned. And once a crowd chooses truth over fear, no one can stop it. The chamber was still buzzing when I stepped down from the podium, my legs trembling but my spirit unbroken. The applause had faded into murmurs, whispers, and phone clicks. Cameras were everywhere now, capturing every moment, every glance, every subtle shift in the room. But I knew better than to think this was over. Theodore Hargrove was not a man who would admit defeat quietly. I had seen his type before, smug, ruthless, and clever enough to hide malice beneath charm. Minutes later, the retaliation began. He approached me with that same arrogant swagger, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Daniels," he said, voice deceptively calm, "I hope you understand the position you've put yourself in. There are consequences for speaking out of turn." I held his gaze. "I understand perfectly, and I accept them, but I do not regret what I said." The room went silent. Even his usual allies paused, sensing the tension crackling in the air. There was fear now, fear they tried desperately to hide behind polite expressions. Then it happened. One of his staff, a man who had been quietly observing from the corner, began whispering to a few officials. A subtle movement, unnoticed by most, but enough to ignite a storm. Documents were passed discreetly, phones exchanged, and I could feel the atmosphere shift in a way that had nothing to do with me alone. The crowd outside the chamber began reacting in real time. Social media notifications started flooding in tweets, live streams, instant posts, videos of my speech circulating faster than I could comprehend. The power Hargrove relied on, his careful control over narrative and perception, was slipping. He realized it too. His face darkened and his voice rose. "This chamber, these people, they are professionals. You do not get to lecture us as if you were some moral authority." I leaned in, lowering my voice so that only him and a few closest listeners could hear. "I am not a moral authority. I am a witness, and witnesses tell the truth. That is my authority." The whispers grew louder, spreading through the chamber like wildfire. One council member, usually silent in the shadows, suddenly stood. "She is right," he said, voice firm. "We have ignored this for too long." Then another voice joined, and another. The murmurs of support turned into audible confrontation. People began challenging Hargrove openly, citing documents, instances, and evidence he had ignored. I realized in that moment that the real power was no longer his. It was the collective truth of every person in that room who refused to be silenced. And then the twist came, the part I had not expected, even in my most daring moments of hope. A reporter stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "Councilman Hargrove," she said, voice steady, "you claimed the issues Ms. Daniels raised were exaggerated. Can you explain these emails?" The emails, now projected on the large screen behind the chamber, revealed months of mismanagement, corruption, and silent cruelty toward the very communities he claimed to serve. Public funds misused, promises broken, complaints ignored. Every claim I had made was validated before everyone's eyes. Hargrove froze. His mouth opened, then closed. His carefully constructed reputation, polished over decades, began to crumble in real time. Whispers turned into gasps. Phones flashed, cameras clicked, and the chamber erupted into chaos. I stood there, holding the podium once again, feeling a mix of triumph and disbelief. I had not planned for this exact outcome, but it was more satisfying than I could have imagined. The very man who had sought to humiliate me now faced the scrutiny he had tried to hide from. And yet, the most shocking moment wasn't Hargrove's humiliation. It was the reaction of the crowd. People who had once doubted me, who had hesitated to speak, now rallied. They began calling for accountability, for hearings, for justice. I realized then that my words had done more than defend my dignity. They had sparked a movement, a collective courage that no single politician could suppress. But as I looked at the faces in the chamber, some gleaming with hope, some tight with fear, I knew that the fight was far from over. Hargrove's network of influence ran deep, and he would not disappear quietly. Still, the tide had turned, and I had a renewed sense of purpose. My voice, once small and shaking, had become a beacon. The real story, the part that would shock everyone to the core, was about to unfold. A twist that no one, not even Hargrove, could anticipate. The murmurs had grown into a roar. The chamber felt alive in a way I had never imagined, as if every wall, every desk, every chair had absorbed the energy of truth finally being spoken. And in that moment, I realized that power is fragile. It exists only until someone dares to challenge it. Councilman Hargrove stood frozen, his usual mask of composure shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He realized, too late, that the tide had turned, and that all the people who had once been silent witnesses were now his judges. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. Part of me worried what he might do next. The other part was filled with a quiet, vindicated joy. I had not only defended myself, but given voice to every person who had been ignored, marginalized, or shamed. And then the twist arrived. One of the city council's senior members, a woman I had long admired but had never spoken to, stood and addressed the chamber with authority. Given the evidence presented today, including the undeniable emails and testimonies, I formally call for an emergency review of Councilman Hargrove's conduct. The room fell silent. Hargrove's face went pale. Even the politicians who had once been his closest allies exchanged nervous glances. The chamber had shifted entirely under the weight of truth. I swallowed hard, keeping my composure. Every eye in the room was on me, expecting something, anger, triumph, pride, but I felt none of that. I only felt the steady beat of justice, patient and persistent, finally catching up. Then came the most unexpected moment. A reporter stepped forward, holding a folder with documents Hargrove had tried desperately to hide. "These records," she announced, voice echoing through the chamber, "show a pattern of harassment and discrimination against multiple employees, including the woman who just spoke. Councilman Hargrove, can you explain this?" I watched as his hands shook slightly. The arrogance, the condescension, the smug confidence, all of it was gone. He had nothing to hide behind anymore. And the crowd, sensing this vulnerability, leaned in closer. I took a breath and spoke again, softer this time, not for him, but for the people in the room, for every witness who had felt powerless for too long. "I am not here to seek revenge. I am here to demand accountability, to ensure that no one else feels the humiliation, the fear, and the erasure that I have endured. And if my voice can prevent even one person from being silenced, then every insult, every doubt, every moment of shame has been worth it." Applause rippled through the chamber, hesitant at first, then stronger. People were standing, clapping, some even cheering. I could see the relief on the faces of other marginalized staff members, the quiet validation in their eyes. And then the final reversal, the part that would shock even those who had been on my side. Hargrove's closest aide, a man who had been his ally through decades of politics, stepped forward. "Councilman, I can no longer support you," he said, voice trembling slightly. "Your actions have compromised this entire council. The public has lost faith. It's time to step down." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then the applause returned, louder this time, a wave of triumph that washed over me in an almost dizzying flood. Hargrove's face contorted with rage, disbelief, and humiliation all at once. He opened his mouth, likely to protest, but the crowd's voices drowned him out. People were no longer just supporting me, they were declaring that the system could be held accountable, that truth had power over privilege. I stepped down from the podium, my knees weak but my spirit stronger than ever. Every step I took was measured, deliberate. I could feel the gaze of the people following me, not as a threat, but as validation. And for the first time in years, I felt seen, not for my mistakes, not for my fear, but for my courage. Outside the chamber, the streets had begun to buzz with news. Social media was alive with clips of my speech, of the councilman's humiliation, of the moment the crowd rose in solidarity. Every notification felt like a drumbeat of justice reverberating across the city. And yet, even in that moment of victory, I knew the story was not over. There would be consequences, backlash, and attempts to undermine the truth. But one thing was certain, the balance had shifted. Power had been questioned. The narrative had been reclaimed. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that no matter what came next, I had discovered something irreversible: the courage to stand, the courage to speak, and the courage to demand that the world acknowledge my worth. The day after the chamber erupted in truth, the city felt different. Even the air seemed heavier, charged with the echoes of what had happened. People spoke in hushed tones about courage and accountability. And yet, my own world felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. Hargrove had vanished from the chamber after his public humiliation, but his presence lingered. The emails, the whispers, the late-night calls, they were all proof that he would not let this go quietly. Power may crumble under truth, but desperation is relentless. By mid-morning, I began receiving emails, thinly veiled threats, subtle attempts to undermine me, anonymous phone calls, messages warning me to stay in my place. The city's undercurrent was shifting, and I could feel it like tremors before an earthquake. And yet I refused to be intimidated. I had faced fear before. I had faced condescension, mockery, and prejudice. And I had stood. So I did what I always did. I faced it head-on. That afternoon, I returned to City Hall, not for another speech, not for applause, but to gather my own strength. The corridors that once felt cold and suffocating now seemed like paths I had earned the right to walk. Every step echoed my determination. Then it happened. Hargrove appeared in the hallway, flanked by two aides. His face was pale, his jaw tight, eyes flicking nervously. He looked more like a man cornered than a politician in control. "Ms. Daniels," he said, voice low but urgent, "this isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. People will regret this. You will regret this." I stood my ground. "No," I said quietly, firmly. "I know exactly what I've started. And I will not apologize for telling the truth." He stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, his carefully curated mask of authority, trying desperately to impose fear. But I had learned something vital that day. No mask could intimidate a person who had already been humiliated publicly and survived it. "You think people will support you?" he sneered. "They'll turn on you, they always do, and I will make sure of it." I felt a wave of anger, but I harnessed it instead of letting it consume me. "People turn on those who are afraid," I said. "And I am not afraid. You've already lost." The aides looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. The balance of power had shifted so subtly that even they recognized it. Hargrove's words no longer carried weight. They were empty threats, desperate attempts to reclaim something he could never recover. And then the emails began surfacing, publicly this time. Journalists had obtained documents he had tried to suppress, evidence of his misconduct, favoritism, and exploitation. The very chamber he once controlled now questioned him, investigated him, and demanded accountability. By evening, the backlash had become national news. Headlines screamed with his failures, his arrogance, and his attempts to silence a Black woman who dared to speak the truth. Every social media feed carried clips of my speech, my confrontation, and his unraveling. And yet, even amidst this triumph, a quiet fear lingered. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is action despite it. I knew Hargrove's desperation could take unexpected forms. I had seen the lengths people would go to protect their reputation, their power, their illusion of control. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the day in my mind. The chamber, the crowd, the whispers of support, it all felt surreal. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind raced with what-ifs, and yet my heart swelled with a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. I thought of my family, my friends, and the countless people who had endured humiliation silently. Today was for them. Today their courage had spoken through me. And somewhere I felt a subtle shift in the world around me. The air was lighter, the city a little more just, and the impossible possibility that one voice, my voice, could spark change, burned bright. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new trials. But for tonight, I let myself feel the weight of victory, the strength of truth, and the quiet joy of standing unbroken. Because Hargrove may have tried to shame me, to intimidate me, to erase me, but he could never erase courage. And courage, once awakened, spreads like wildfire. The morning air was crisp as I returned to City Hall, but this time it felt different. Not tense, not fearful, not fraught with humiliation, but electric with anticipation. Today would be the day that truth finally settled and justice was no longer a concept whispered in hallways. I walked into the chamber and the atmosphere was charged. Council members whispered urgently among themselves. Journalists adjusted cameras, ready to capture every word. And in the center, Theodore Hargrove stood, a man stripped bare of his carefully constructed power. He looked at me once, a fleeting flicker of recognition and fear crossing his features. But I didn't flinch. I had learned long ago that courage is not dependent on fear, it is fueled by it. The session began. I spoke first, calm, measured, unwavering. "I am not here to humiliate anyone," I said. "I am here to ensure that accountability exists. For every person who has been ignored, belittled, or silenced, the time for truth is now." Hargrove opened his mouth, ready to protest, but the chamber didn't wait. Evidence had been submitted, witnesses were prepared, and the public had spoken through their cameras, their social media, and their presence. He could no longer control the narrative. Then the twist, a revelation so profound that it left the chamber stunned. One of the senior council members, usually loyal to Hargrove, stepped forward. "Not only has Ms. Daniels' testimony been verified," he said, voice steady, "but independent audits of city funds reveal misuse and discrimination dating back years." Councilman Hargrove has been exploiting his position and undermining the very people he swore to serve. Gasps filled the room. I could feel the collective disbelief. Hargrove's face contorted, his carefully rehearsed defenses crumbling. And then, the final shocking blow. A video had surfaced, recorded months earlier, of Hargrove speaking condescendingly about Black employees, mocking their ambitions, and plotting ways to discredit anyone who challenged him. His own words, captured unedited, now broadcast in the chamber. The room fell silent, and in that silence the crowd found its voice. "Resign," someone shouted. "Justice," another called. A wave of voices rose, echoing through the marble halls. Hargrove's allies began shifting uncomfortably, some silently nodding, others avoiding eye contact. The chamber had turned completely. Hargrove tried to speak, but no one listened. His reign of fear, manipulation, and condescension was over. Then the council chair spoke, final and unyielding. Effective immediately, Councilman Hargrove is suspended pending a full investigation, and Ms. Daniels will be invited to serve on the committee overseeing these proceedings. I felt my knees tremble, not from fear, but from relief, vindication, and the incredible weight of history being made. But the story did not end there. As I stepped down from the podium, journalists swarmed me, eager for my words. I looked at the faces in the chamber, the staff, the citizens, the ordinary people who had witnessed something extraordinary, and I realized that courage does not exist in isolation. It exists in community, in the willingness of people to rise together, to confront injustice, and to demand that truth be recognized. Then, the final twist, a human moment I had not anticipated. Hargrove, broken, humiliated, yet still defiant, approached me privately. "You think this is over?" He whispered, venom thin in his voice. I looked at him calmly. "This is not about me," I said. "It is about every voice you tried to silence, and they will not be silenced again." He turned and walked away, the chamber watching. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Revenge is fleeting. Justice, when earned through truth and courage, lasts forever. That night, as the city buzzed with news of Hargrove's fall and my new role in the council, I sat in my small apartment, feeling the weight of the day settle. My body was tired, but my spirit soared. I had been humiliated, doubted, and mocked, but I had stood. And standing had changed everything. I thought of the people I represented, the ones whose voices had been ignored, the ones who had been forced into silence. I thought of the young girls and boys, the staff members, the ordinary citizens who needed to know that truth matters more than power. And I knew that the most powerful moment of all was not the fall of a politician, but the rise of courage. The rise of a community that refused to be silenced. Because in the end, the world does not belong to those who humiliate. It belongs to those who have the strength to rise, to speak, and to stand. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet promise to myself and to every person who had been silenced. I will never be quiet again, and neither will you.